Miss Marple and the Secret of the Painted Parlor, Chapter 1. The Tea That Ended Too Soon. It began, as these things so often did in St. Clotilde's in the Wold, with tea and lemon drizzle cake. The occasion was the unveiling of the newly redecorated parlour at the Old Bell Cottage, home to Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, one of the more flamboyant members of the local Women's Guild, and an unrepentant devotee of the arts and crafts movement. Her invitation had arrived by post, penned in violet ink and sealed with a wax impression of a peacock. "It's simply ghastly, all that teal and copper leaf," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, adjusting her fox fur stole as she leaned toward Reverend Merriweather. "But one must go, of course. One simply must." Go they did. Half the village, it seemed, descended on the Old Bell that Saturday afternoon. Miss Marple, in her dove-grey shawl and sprigged muslin dress, was among them, seated unobtrusively by the window, knitting needles clacking gently in rhythm with the hum of gossip that filled the parlour. Lavinia herself presided over the gathering with theatrical flair, gesturing at the newly painted wall panels that bore hand-stencilled vines and florals. "A triumph of taste, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" she asked with a triumphant sweep of her arm. "I should never presume to judge modern design," said Miss Marple mildly, her eyes not on the wall but on the man by the fireplace, shifting uncomfortably in his polished leather shoes. Mr. Mark Sanditon, Lavinia's distant cousin visiting from London, was looking pale. Not ill, precisely. More disturbed. Across the room, the young widow Alice Dunnington sat stiffly with her teacup, her gloved fingers trembling just slightly. Behind her, one could hear the dry chuckle of Colonel Enderby, whose booming laugh always followed the mention of money or misfortune. It was all very ordinary, very English, until, quite suddenly, it was not. The tea service had just been replenished when Lavinia Pinkerton excused herself to fetch a photograph album from the little cabinet in the painted parlour just next door. The room fell into light conversation until a scream sliced through the late afternoon. It was Alice Dunnington. Several guests rose at once, but Miss Marple remained seated. Her knitting paused. The yarn looped delicately between her fingers. Within moments, Colonel Enderby returned, red-faced and breathless. "She's collapsed," he barked. "Lavinia! On the floor! Call for Dr. Fothergill, someone!" Reverend Merriweather had already dashed outside. Miss Marple, serene as ever, rose and made her way to the painted parlour. The room was not quite as garish as Mrs. Price Ridley had claimed. The murals, intricate looping vines in sage and gold, twisted around the skirting boards like ivy reclaiming stone. But the body on the floor dispelled any thought of aesthetics. Lavinia Pinkerton lay crumpled near the bureau, one arm flung over a small open drawer. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape. A teacup, shattered, lay nearby, its saucer cracked in two like a broken seal. "It must have been her heart," muttered Mr. Sanditon, who had now joined them, his collar slightly askew. "No," said Miss Marple so quietly that only Alice Dunnington, standing beside her frozen, seemed to hear. "What do you mean?" Alice asked, voice hushed. "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that Miss Pinkerton was not holding the teacup when it fell. Her hands are perfectly clean, you see. But the lip of the cup, there's rouge on it." Dr. Fothergill arrived moments later, declaring Lavinia dead of an apparent coronary, and the constable was summoned as a formality. The guests were told gently but firmly to remain at the house for questioning. Most obliged, grumbling and speculating as only villagers could. A few were already reshaping the event in their minds, exaggerating their nearness to the drama. Miss Marple sat again by the window, her knitting untouched. She watched as Mark Sanditon fumbled with a cigarette, as Alice Dunnington quietly slipped from the room, and as Colonel Enderby stood with arms folded, studying the painted vines. She didn't speak again for the rest of the afternoon, but her eyes, bright and ancient, took in everything. Something, she felt, had just begun. And something else, perhaps something much older, had come, finally, to an end. Chapter 2. Whispers over China Cup is the following morning. The news had spread like spilled jam on a doily. "Dead right there in her own parlour," said Mr. Pettigrew, the village grocer, as he packed a half-pound of sugar for Mrs. Oxley. Shame, that. Still, she always did seem a bit dramatic. Dramatic, yes, Mrs. Oxley sniffed, but not the sort to just drop in the middle of a Saturday tea. And she wasn't even that old, if you think about it. 74, said Miss Hartnell, who had joined the queue behind her. Not young, but not ancient either. She was in good spirits yesterday. I saw her at the butcher's just that morning, giving poor young Michael an earful about lean pork. Miss Marple, who was selecting apples at the next stall, didn't look up. Her face was calm, even cheerful, but she noted the tone of the village, the excitement that swelled beneath the shock. People enjoyed a death, particularly one with a twist. By midday, the constable's report had reached the vicarage. "It appears the cause of death was, indeed, heart failure," said Reverend Merriweather, seated in his study across from Miss Marple. "But I don't know. Something about it felt wrong. She was always so robust, annoyingly so, in fact." "She was frightened of something," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands in her lap. "Her eyes told me that much. The Reverend frowned. "You think she knew she was about to die?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "she suspected someone might try to help her along." Silence fell between them for a moment, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you notice Mr. Sanditon's behaviour yesterday?" "I did," the Reverend admitted. "He seemed very anxious. Then again, he was only visiting. Big city folk don't always do well with sudden tragedy." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It may be that, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Tell me, do you recall Lavinia ever mentioning a will? She spoke of it to my wife once, said she'd recently updated it, wanted everything to be as it should be." "As it should be," Miss Marple echoed softly. "Yes, I dare say. That's the kind of phrase one uses when one has changed something people might not expect." Later that day, the guests from the tea party were gathered once more, this time at the village hall, for a brief inquiry held by Inspector Crail, a sharp-featured man with the sort of moustache that looked permanently disappointed. "I'd like to thank you all for your cooperation," Crail said. "While Dr. Fothergill has recorded heart failure as the official cause of death, it is standard procedure to conduct interviews in cases of sudden collapse, especially in front of witnesses." "Sudden," muttered Colonel Enderby. "It was like she'd seen a ghost." "Did anyone else notice anything unusual in Miss Pinkerton's behaviour yesterday?" the inspector asked, glancing around. She seemed a bit flustered, offered Alice Dunnington, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. When she came back from the kitchen, just before she went to fetch the album, I thought she looked pale. She always looked pale, Mrs. Price Ridley scoffed. It was all that ridiculous powder she used. She practically bathed in the stuff. Inspector Crail made a note. And you, Mr. Sanditon. As her guest, were you aware of any recent health issues? Mark Sanditon cleared his throat. No, nothing specific. But my cousin did mention. Well, perhaps I shouldn't. Go on, the inspector prompted. Mark shifted in his chair. She said she'd received a letter, something that troubled her. She wouldn't show it to me. What sort of letter? Crail pressed. She called it a warning, but she wouldn't say from whom, just said it was anonymous and mentioned something about the parlour. There was a ripple of murmurs. Did she mention anything else? Miss Marple asked gently, though she wasn't officially part of the inquiry. Mark blinked at her, then hesitated. She said, They never forgave me, you know. Not really, but I never thought they'd go this far. Miss Marple folded her hands over her handbag. Curious thing to say, don't you think? The inspector glanced her way. Miss Marple, have you any reason to believe this death was suspicious? She smiled politely. Oh no, Inspector. Not reason, just a feeling. A very old feeling indeed. By the time the inquiry ended, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the wind rustled, dry leaves across the cobbled path behind the hall. Miss Marple walked slowly home, taking the longer way through the churchyard. Her mind, as usual, was several steps ahead. A letter, a warning, a change in the will, and rouge on a teacup that had not been drunk from by the person who died. She thought of Alice Dunnington, so pale, so seemingly gentle, of Colonel Enderby with his military manner and thinly disguised contempt, of Mark Sanditon, nervous and evasive, and of the painted parlour itself, a room recently renovated perhaps, to cover something up, or to stage something new. The vines along the wall had been meticulously painted, but one in particular had caught her attention. A small detail, perhaps no more than a smudge, or perhaps the hint of something beneath the paint. Miss Marple did not believe in accidents, not of this sort. She paused at the gate of her cottage and looked up at the stars just beginning to appear. There is something rotten, she murmured, beneath all that peacock blue. Chapter 3. The Vines That Grew Too Neatly. 3 days after the death of Miss Pinkerton, the Old Bell Cottage stood strangely silent. The windows remained shuttered, and the flowers in the front garden, usually so obsessively trimmed, began to droop in the early September heat. No one had seen Mr. Sanditon since the day of the inquiry. According to Mrs. Fawcett, who passed by twice daily with her corgi, the curtains hadn't moved once. Up to something, no doubt, she told her neighbour, Miss Hartnell. London types always are. Miss Marple did not comment on this directly, but she did take a particular interest in the old bell herself that morning. She wandered past slowly, knitting bag dangling from one wrist, and paused as if suddenly unsure of her way. A common trick of hers, entirely innocent on the surface. Her eyes lingered on the painted window panes, where a faint glimmer of copper leaf still caught the morning sun. Something about them. Too new, perhaps. Too intentional. She had just resumed walking when the door opened with a suddenness that made her stop. It was Mark Sanditon. He looked worse than before. His hair was unkempt, his collar misaligned, and his face drawn and flushed with a sleepless hue. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Do come in if that's your intention. I suppose everyone thinks I'm hiding something." She tilted her head gently. "Only those who are inclined to think such things about strangers, Mr. Sanditon. I prefer to think you're merely grieving." E.T. chuckled without humour and stood aside to let her pass. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of varnish and tea leaves. A thin layer of dust had begun to settle on the sideboard. The parlour door was closed. "I haven't touched anything," he said. "The inspector told me not to, but even if he hadn't, I couldn't." Miss Marple nodded, but made no immediate comment. She moved slowly, eyes roving the hall as if searching for nothing at all. "You mentioned your cousin had been worried about that letter." "Yes," he said, sighing. "I still can't find it. I searched her writing desk, even emptied out the little copper bin. Nothing." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "you're looking in the wrong sort of place." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She was a woman of performance, wasn't she? Fond of the dramatic. She might have hidden it somewhere symbolic. Somewhere she felt safe. Mark blinked at her, then turned toward the painted parlour. They stepped inside. The room was still just as it had been. The golden vines twisting up the skirting, the teal walls dappled with patterned light from the stained glass window. But in the quiet of the morning it felt colder, staged. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the wall just beside the bureau, the one where the vines looped in an elegant spiral. She approached, then leaned close, almost imperceptibly. "There," she murmured. "What? See that small bulge in the wall?" she asked, pointing. "Just beneath the second vine curl. It looks like the plaster's slightly raised." Mark stared. Then, hesitantly, he stepped forward and pressed it. Nothing happened. "No, no," Miss Marple said. "Don't press. Tap." He did. A hollow sound responded. With his fingernails, Mark began to scrape gently at the edge of the painted vine. To his astonishment, a thin panel popped loose, revealing a shallow recess in the wall. Inside, it was a folded letter, yellow paper, sealed in wax. Mark's hands trembled as he passed it to Miss Marple. She opened it carefully, reading in silence. "You can paint over guilt, but it still bleeds through. I know what happened in 1915. I know what you did to her, and what you took. The vines may twist prettily, but they choke just the same. Beware the parlour. It will not keep your secrets forever." There was no signature. Miss Marple folded it, again with reverence. "This," she said, "is not the work of a prankster. Whoever wrote this knew her history." Mark looked shaken. "What happened in 1915? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She was looking at the wall again. Her fingers brushed the edge of the false panel. Then she said quietly, "Tell me, Mr. Sanditon, what did Lavinia inherit when your great-aunt Winifred died?" Mark blinked. "You mean her sister? Well, the cottage for one, the furniture, I believe, and a collection of paintings that she sold to some gallery in Surrey. But it was a modest inheritance, really. Winifred was rather reclusive." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Yes, reclusive, and rather suspicious, if I remember correctly." She once accused her own maid of poisoning her tea, though no one believed. Her? Poisoning? Mark looked sharply at her. Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. That was long ago. No proof. But your cousin Lavinia, she was clever. And she knew how to make people believe things that weren't necessarily true. She turned toward the fireplace, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It would be helpful," she murmured, "to speak with whoever painted these vines." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on young Michael Thayer, the apprentice carpenter and occasional decorator whose broad shoulders and shy demeanour were well known in the village. She found him in the workshop behind the greengrocer's, smoothing a plank of beechwood. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised, "looking for something?" "I was wondering, dear boy, whether you might answer a small question about your most recent commission." "You mean the old bell?" "Sure. Miss Pinkerton hired me to prep and undercoat the walls, but the final detailing, the vines and so on, that wasn't me. She said an old friend would finish it." "An old friend?" Michael nodded. "Never met him. She was very secretive. Said he was from her past. Sent the paints by post. She had very specific instructions. Wouldn't even let me in once he arrived. And did you notice anything strange about the paint?" Michael paused, frowning. "Well, it smelled different. Not like normal enamel. More bitter, I suppose. Sharp. But I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. That night she sat by her fire, knitting in her lap, the folded letter on the table beside her. Outside the wind stirred the hedges like whispers in the dark. She did not yet know who had sent the warning, but she was now quite certain of one thing. The vines were not the only thing painted in that parlour. They were covering something, and if she could find what lay beneath, she might finally see what Lavinia Pinkerton had died protecting. Chapter 4. The man with the missing name, Miss Marple, rose early the next morning, her breakfast untouched, her thoughts as tangled as the ivy, climbing the stone wall outside her window. She had spent the night in thought, the letter from the hidden wall recess folded neatly beside her teacup, its cryptic contents replaying in her mind like a half-remembered nursery rhyme. "You can paint over guilt, but it still bleeds through." Something or someone had returned from Lavinia Pinkerton's past. Someone who knew about 1915. Someone who had sent a warning veiled as poetry and hidden it behind a flourish of vines. The parlour had not been redecorated for beauty. It had been prepared. But by whom? She dressed more quickly than usual and made her way to the cottage hospital, where Dr. Fothergill had his surgery. He was a tidy man with bristling eyebrows and a penchant for orderly records. Miss Marple was one of the few people he tolerated interruptions from. He raised his head as she knocked lightly on the open door. "Ah, Miss Marple. Still poking around the Pinkerton business, I imagine." "Just following a gentle curiosity," she said sweetly. "I was wondering, when you examined Lavinia's body, did you find anything odd? Something not quite fitting?" Dr. Fothergill snorted. "Aside from the fact that she dropped like a stone at the height of her social event? Yes, I found it odd. No signs of trauma, no obvious toxic residue. But there was one thing." "Yes?" He reached into his desk drawer and produced a small plastic envelope. Inside it was a fragment of broken china, the rim of a teacup. "This was in her hand," he said, clutched tight. "It was stained with lipstick, not hers." Miss Marple took the envelope gently, studying the ceramic shard. "You're quite sure?" She hadn't a speck on her lips. No lipstick, no powder smudge. And the colour. Look, at it. Crimson. Lavinia always wore pink or lilac. Yes, and there was only one woman at the gathering known to wear crimson. Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful. "Alice Dunnington?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Exactly. By noon, she was seated in Alice Dunnington's small sitting room. The widow was as delicately composed as ever, her tea service immaculate, her skirt uncreased despite the warm weather. "You always bring a cool breeze with you, Miss Marple," Alice said, smiling faintly. "Though I suspect this is not a social visit. You're quite right, my dear. I simply wished to talk about Lavinia. Such a shock." Alice nodded. She was never an easy woman, but she didn't deserve that. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "Did you know she'd had the parlour repainted by someone she called an old friend? No one seems to know who." Alice's smile faltered. "No, she never mentioned that to me." "No? That's strange. She trusted you, didn't she? You were her companion for nearly 2 years, after all." Alice placed her cup down. "We weren't quite companions. I helped her arrange her correspondence, sometimes accompanied her to the Women's Guild, that's all. But you were the first to scream when she collapsed." Alice looked away. Yes, I had just stepped into the hallway. I was going to see if she needed help with the photograph album. I heard a sound, something like a gasp or a fall. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And you didn't notice the teacup in her hand?" Alice hesitated. No, I was too shocked." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "These things do catch us unprepared." She let the silence stretch between them before rising. "Thank you, my dear. Just a few details, you know. I mess." Chapter 5. A Face in the Frame. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, the kind of weather that pressed low upon the village roofs and made every sound feel like a whisper. Miss Marple rose early, not out of habit but urgency. She had a new thread to tug at, one that had been hidden for decades beneath vines, silence, and time. Jonathan Loxley. Not dead in 1915 as the paper claimed. Spotted again in 1930, living under a false name. And now, if Miss Marple's instincts were right, he had returned once more, not in public, not in plain sight, but quietly, behind the fresh paint of a murder scene. She wrapped a grey wool shawl about her shoulders and stepped out into the damp morning. Her destination was not the old Bell cottage, not yet, but the vicarage. More specifically, the study of Mrs. Merriweather, who kept every parish invitation, every village newsletter, and most importantly, every photograph from local events, dating back nearly 30 years. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Merriweather, already bustling toward the tall cupboard where she kept her scrapbooks. "I've got the lot, Miss Marple. Garden parties, pageants, cricket teas, you name it. I'm especially interested in the late 1920s to early 1930s, Miss Marple said, folding her hands politely. "Any photographs from village fêtes or charity auctions?" "Gracious!" Mrs. Merriweather exclaimed as she flipped through pages. "That was the year Lavinia made those dreadful lemon soufflés. And I remember she brought a guest once, not a man from here. Dreadful tie." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "May I see?" They stopped at a photo from 1931. A summer gathering under bunting and parasols. Lavinia Pinkerton stood stiffly near a lemonade table, a man beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, slightly blurred, but his profile unmistakable. Sharp nose, close set, eyes the shadow of a beard. He did not smile. "That's him," Mrs. Merriweather said. "Strange, now that I look at it. Never learned his name." Miss Marple lifted the page delicately. "Would you allow me to borrow this for a day, dear?" "Of course. Just don't let the damp get to it." From the vicarage, she went straight to the police station. Inspector Crail was there, sorting through papers with the kind of energy that suggested frustration rather than progress. "I don't often bring you things, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, placing the scrapbook on his desk, "but I think you ought to look at this." Crail adjusted his spectacles, frowning. "What am I looking at?" "That," she said, pointing to the man in the photograph beside Lavinia, "is Jonathan Locksley." "I thought he died in 1915. So, did we all? But Colonel Enderby saw him in 1930, and this photo confirms he was back here in St. Clotilde's by 31, under another name, possibly others since." Crail leaned back, brow furrowed. "So, what are you suggesting?" "I believe he's our painter, the old friend Lavinia referred to. He may even be the author of the letter. But more than that, I think he came back with a grudge. And unfinished business. Oh, still no proof of foul play," Crail said, though he no longer sounded convinced. "Then we must keep looking," said Miss Marple gently. "In particular, I suggest we examine the bureau in the painted parlour again. Not the drawer she died beside, the base of it, where the wood's warped." Crail blinked. "You think something's hidden there, I think," said Miss Marple, rising. "That something never meant to be found was sealed away, and someone wanted to retrieve it." The parlour was colder now. Its vines seemed more sinister in the daylight. With Crail beside her, Miss Marple knelt beside the bureau and tapped lightly at the panel beneath its lowest drawer. Hollow. Crail produced a small pocket-knife and wedged it under the panel. With a quiet creak, it popped loose. Dust billowed out, and something else, a photograph album, faded leather, wrapped in muslin. Inside were a dozen photographs, some familiar, others not. Lavinia and Winifred as children, the cottage before the renovations. And then, toward the back, 2 photographs that made Crail whistle. One was of Jonathan Locksley and Lavinia, seated on a garden bench, their hands clasped. The second showed Locksley alone, holding a small child. "What the devil is this?" Crail murmured. Miss Marple studied it. It would appear that Lavinia had a child. No record of one. No birth announcement. No christening. But clearly there was a child. Crail was quiet a moment. "Do you think that's what this is about? A hidden child? I think Lavinia was afraid of someone coming to claim what they believed was theirs. And I think whoever wrote that letter knew the truth. But then, why would she invite this Locksley man back into her life?" Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Because Lavinia was many things, Inspector, but above all, she was controlling. If she knew he was back, she may have thought it safer to bring him close than keep him out. Control the narrative, as it were. Perhaps even to manipulate it once more." Crail looked at her with something like reluctant admiration. "You know, if you ever wanted a badge—" "Oh, no, Inspector. I find aprons far more flattering. Back in her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat with the album open beside her, a small magnifying glass in hand. She studied the image of Vorhain, the child again, a little girl, perhaps 3 years old, standing by the edge of a hedge, her face half turned, her hand raised in a wave, not Lavinia's niece, as the village had always assumed, her daughter. So where was she now? Miss Marple thought of the women who had come and gone in Lavinia's circle, of those taken in over the years, housekeepers, companions, secretaries. One stood out now, pale, proper, and unassuming. Alice Dunnington. She'd arrived in St. Clotilde's not long after Lavinia's sister died, never spoke of family, took to the role of companion with graceful ease, and had on more than one occasion referred to Lavinia as the only person who ever truly understood me. Miss Marple folded her hands. If Lavinia had once taken a child and buried her past under a different name, it might explain the strange protectiveness she'd shown toward Alice. And it might explain, too, why Lavinia was afraid if Jonathan Locksley had returned and discovered the truth. Alice Dunnington might not just be Lavinia's ward, she might be her daughter. And if so, who stood to lose the most from that truth being uncovered? The man who left them both behind? Or the woman raised in a lie? The truth, Miss Marple knew, was buried not only in painted vines, but in bloodlines, and secrets that no one ever intended to bloom again. Chapter 6. Tea with Inheritance. The following. Afternoon found St. Clotilde's unusually still. A drizzle fell in faint, intermittent threads over the village green, and the chimneys of the cottages breathed faint grey wisps into the wet air. Even the usual rhythm of gossip had quieted into expectant silence, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple, however, was quite active. She had arranged a small tea-gathering of her own, not an open invitation like Lavinia's fateful party, but a carefully selected meeting of 3 individuals: Alice Dunnington, Colonel Enderby, and Mr. Mark Sanditon. She laid out currant scones, thinly sliced cucumber sandwiches, and an orange marmalade cake made to a wartime recipe that had never once failed to open up conversation. They arrived within minutes of one another, each with polite smiles and the faint unease of people who do not yet know why they have been brought together. "How lovely," Alice murmured, adjusting her gloves as she sat. "You do always make such a peaceful table, Miss Marple." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "I find a quiet cup is often the best way to reach the truth." Mark Sanditon chuckled nervously. "You sound like a detective." "No," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I simply listen." Colonel Enderby grunted, tearing his scone with military precision. "Still think the whole business smells off. If you ask me, someone didn't want Lavinia alive long enough to speak." Alice sipped her tea, but the doctor was clear. It was her heart. Miss Marple dabbed at her mouth with a napkin. "Indeed, though there are things that can make a heart stop, are there not?" Mark stiffened. "Do you mean poison?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she placed a photograph album on the table. "I came across this in the base of Lavinia's bureau. Curious place to keep family photographs, don't you think?" She opened it slowly to the image of the child, the little girl standing by the hedge, her small face half visible. There, was a pause. Then Alice said softly, "I don't think I've ever seen that photo before." "No?" Miss Marple's voice was light. "That's odd, because I believe you're in it. The angle disguises the face, but the posture, the way the child holds her arm, it matches a sketch Lavinia once did of you as a girl. It hangs in the upstairs hallway of her cottage, if I'm not mistaken." Alice paled slightly. "That's absurd." Colonel Enderby leaned forward. "Are you saying Lavinia had a child? That she hid her?" Mark looked from one to the other, bewildered. "That would explain the inheritance clause. I saw the new will. Everything was to go to a dependent in her care, not named for reasons of personal protection. I thought it meant me." "No," said Miss Marple calmly. "It meant Alice." Alice placed her teacup down with a sharp clink. "That's ridiculous." "But you never spoke of your parents," Miss Marple said gently. "You came to the village under Lavinia's wing. No family traced, no background, yet you were fiercely loyal to her, almost as if, somewhere in you, you knew, even if it was never said aloud." Alice's voice cracked slightly. "She never told me." "No, but I think you suspected. And I think, recently, Lavinia was preparing to make it official." There was a silence, broken only by the rain against the windows. Mark Sanditon, red-faced now, muttered, "Well." Chapter 7. The Shadows Beneath the Paint. The next day St. Clotilde's was abuzz again, not with gossip, but with quiet unease. Word had reached the villagers that Inspector Crail had retrieved the stained teacup from Dr. Fothergill and sent it off to the county lab for toxicology. That, in itself, was rare enough to cause whisperings at the greengrocer's, the post office, and even the churchyard path. Miss Marple, however, was focused elsewhere. She stood once again inside the painted parlor of the Old Bell Cottage, alone except for the inspector. The soft light filtering through the stained glass window dappled the golden vines, making them appear almost alive in the hush of morning. "Anything?" Crail asked, arms crossed. "I don't know yet," Miss Marple replied, "but I think we've all been looking above the truth, not beneath it." She pointed to the floorboards. Crail frowned. "You think something's hidden under the floor now?" "Not hidden," she said quietly. "Preserved." Kneeling, she tapped a cane along the seams of the old oak boards. When she reached the corner of the room, just beneath the lowest curl of the painted vine, there was a subtle difference in sound. Duller, hollow. Crail knelt beside her. With a small pry tool, he worked at the board. After a few tense seconds, it lifted with a dry creak. Inside was a cavity no larger than a bread box, and in it a folded oilcloth bundle. Crail opened it slowly. Within were two items, a small leather-bound notebook and a silver locket on a velvet cord. The locket was tarnished, the clasp stiff from age. Crail opened it, revealing two miniatures inside, watercolour portraits. One of Lavinia, unmistakably younger. The other of a man. "Locksley," Crail muttered. "So she kept this all these years." Miss Marple took the notebook. Inside were entries, brief, fragmented, and written in an anxious, angular script. The early pages were dated 1915. "He's gone again. Always says it's for us, for the future. I no longer believe him. Winifred suspects. She says I've been foolish. But I will not give her up. I can't. They won't accept her. Not here, not now. So I've given her a new name. She'll be Alice, and she'll be safe." Crail looked over her shoulder, brow furrowed. "So Alice really is her daughter?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Raised not as a ward, but as a secret. Lavinia never married Locksley. The scandal would have ruined her in those days, especially with Winifred watching every move." Crail shook his head. "But why hide the journal here? And what was the significance of the painted vines?" "I believe Lavinia knew someone was watching her," Miss Marple said. "Someone from the past. She couldn't destroy these things, not emotionally at least, but she could hide them. And then she had the room painted, a distraction, a flourish to draw the eye away." Crail turned the pages until they reached an entry dated just 6 weeks before her death. He's written, again, John, or Jonathan, whatever name he wears now. He says he's returning, claims he's changed, but I know better. He wants something. Perhaps Alice, perhaps revenge. If anything happens to me, I want the truth known. Alice deserves to know who she is. But I fear it's too late to undo what's been painted over. That afternoon, Crail summoned both Alice Dunnington and Mark Sanditon to the station under the guise of routine questioning. Miss Marple sat quietly to the side, as ever unnoticed, an old woman with knitting needles who just happened to be there. Crail leaned over the desk. "We've confirmed that the teacup held a small but fatal dose of digitalis, administered in a way that wouldn't be immediately detectable. The cup had lipstick on the rim, bright crimson. Miss Dunnington, you were the only one at the gathering wearing that shade." Alice's hands trembled. "I didn't. Do you think I—" Crail raised a hand. "No accusations yet. But the cup was found broken, and the rim, with the lipstick, was clutched in Miss Pinkerton's hand. That doesn't happen unless someone passes her a cup, and she notices something wrong." Mark stood abruptly. "This is madness. You think Alice poisoned her own—" "What, Mother? You expect us to believe that?" Alice turned toward him, colour rising in her cheeks. "I didn't know she was my mother. Not truly. But she must have planned to tell me. Why else would she hide all of that?" "You stood to inherit everything," Crail said flatly. "Mark, you didn't. How do you explain that?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Maybe she saw what a parasite I was. She said she brought me down to discuss the estate. But when I arrived, she treated me like a schoolboy." "And you were in and out of the kitchen that day," Crail added. "You even served some of the tea, according to the vicar's wife." "Didn't poison her," Mark snapped. "If you think I did, prove it." Miss Marple finally looked up from her knitting. Perhaps the person who killed her wasn't afraid of Lavinia revealing the truth. Perhaps they were afraid of Alice finding out. Alice looked stunned. "Me?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "You see, my dear, Lavinia had finally decided to tell you everything. She wrote it in her diary. She even left behind the locket and the photograph album. But someone who had lived his entire adult life erasing his past, couldn't allow that to happen." She turned her gaze to the inspector. "There is only one person who stood to lose everything, not just money, but identity, if the truth came to light." Crail nodded. "We've put out a notice for Jonathan Locksley, or rather, John Lester, his alias since the 1930s. It turns out he's been living abroad, dealing in antiques. Last year, he quietly returned to England. He's been staying in a rented house just outside the village, registered under an assumed name, the painter of the parlour. Alice stared at him in horror. He was here. I saw him once, outside the cottage in the evening. I thought I was imagining things. Miss Marple nodded. He wanted to see you, but not as a father, as a man trying to decide whether to reclaim or destroy his past. When Lavinia refused him again, when she told him she would give everything to you and reveal the truth, he acted. Crail closed the file on his desk. We'll bring him in, with the letter, the journal, and the toxicology it will hold. Alice looked down at her hands. He was a ghost to me, and now he's a murderer. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Some secrets are better left buried, but others need light to bloom. The rain had stopped, and beneath the painted vines the truth had begun to grow. Chapter 8. The Man Who Painted Over Time. The man who called himself John Lester was apprehended just before dawn, on the outskirts of Little Graysby, a village some 10 miles from St. Clotilde's. He had been staying at a modest let above a closed-down bicycle repair shop, paying in cash and using a passport under yet another name, Jonathan Marks. The inspector arrived, with 2 constables before he could vanish again. "I knew you'd come," Locksley muttered as Crail entered the narrow flat. His beard was longer now, grey threading through the dark, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same ones from the photograph Lavinia had hidden in the locket. At the station, he was subdued, polite, disturbingly calm. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I only wanted to speak to her." "And yet," Crail replied, "she ends up dead not 3 days after you arrive in the village. Her tea poisoned, a letter sent, a parlour painted." Locksley looked toward the window. "I sent the letter to frighten her, not to harm her. And the painting. The painting was her idea. You returned after nearly 40 years of silence and chose to scare a woman in her 70s? Crail asked sharply. "She owed me more than silence," Locksley muttered. "She took my child. She erased me from both their lives. I never agreed to that." From her corner seat in the interrogation room, Miss Marple said gently, "But you left, didn't you, Mr. Locksley? You boarded a ship, changed your name, and began a new life. You abandoned Lavinia and the child you never met. She gave me no choice, didn't she?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "She wrote to you more than once, even after the war, but you never replied." He looked down. Crail opened the leather-bound journal and slid it across the table. "Recognize this?" Locksley hesitated, then nodded once. "Her handwriting?" "And yet you still claim you didn't poison her." "I had no reason to," Locksley said. "I came back because I wanted to meet Alice, to see her face. Nothing more." "But she didn't know who you were." "No," he said, his voice darkening, "because Lavinia was preparing to tell her. And once she did, once Alice knew, I wouldn't have had a chance to explain. I would have been the villain again." "You sent a letter full of veiled threats," Crail said. "You painted a room to distract, or perhaps to hide something. You confronted Lavinia, and she ends up dead." Locksley's jaw clenched. "I didn't poison her." Miss Marple studied him. "Then who did?" He said nothing. Back in her cottage later that day, Miss Marple stood at her sideboard, slowly polishing a silver spoon with her lace handkerchief. Her mind, however, was not on the silver. It was on the one part of the story that still didn't sit right. Locksley had motive, he had means, but his manner, it was all too theatrical. A man like him, she thought, wouldn't poison a woman with a teacup. He would vanish again, as he always had. Or he would rage. He was selfish, yes, bitter. But poison required patience, closeness, and above all, trust. There was someone else. Someone who had access to Lavinia's teacups. Someone who had been in the kitchen during the tea gathering. Someone who stood just as much to lose. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She returned to the Old Bell cottage that evening, this time alone. The inspector had allowed the property to be temporarily unsealed, though it would remain under observation. She walked the creaking hallway with Chapter 9. The garden gate closes. The arrest of Alice Dunnington sent gentle tremors through the village of St. Clotilde's. No one shouted. No one stormed into the street. But windows opened a little wider. Voices dropped to murmurs, and heads turned in unison when the news was whispered at the post office or the baker's. "She always seemed so polite," said Mrs. Oxley to Miss Hartnell, as they inspected a display of sponge cakes. "A quiet thing. Always said thank you." "Quiet ones often are the most dangerous," Miss Hartnell replied sagely, though with less certainty than usual. "She lived with Lavinia, you know. All those years. It's always the ones closest who turn." "And what about the painter?" someone asked. "The man from nowhere." "Oh, him," sniffed Mrs. Oxley. "Just another ghost come back too late." In a village like St. Clotilde's, it wasn't the scandal that lingered. It was the discomfort of misjudgment. To have believed one thing and discovered another. To have welcomed someone at tea and then been told they had murder in their heart. But while the village gossiped, Miss Marple sat by her garden, trimming deadheads from her rose bushes with quiet, precise snips. Her mind was not entirely at rest. Alice's guilt had been, in a way, accidental, born of fear, not malice. But there remained a final knot in the tapestry, a thread still pulling somewhere beneath the surface. The painter, Jonathan Locksley, or John Lester, had remained at the station, neither denying nor confessing, existing in a liminal space between past and present. His role, though peripheral to the death itself, still held a haunting weight. And more than that, Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that he had known what Alice planned. Not entirely, but something. She had seen it in his face during the interview. The look of a man who recognized the consequences of what he had stirred, and chose not to stop it. That was not innocence. That was a mission, and omissions, Miss Marple knew, were often worse than lies. That evening, she visited Inspector Crail once more. The station was quiet, and the inspector looked more fatigued than usual. His sleeves rolled up, his collar loose. "She's confessed in a way," he said as he poured them both tea. "Said it wasn't meant to kill, just to stop things." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe her. It fits. She was already halfway to unravelling when I first spoke to her about Lavinia's will. But there's something else, Inspector." Crail raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" Miss Marple placed a small parcel on the table. Inside was a folded canvas scrap. Part of the painter's cloth retrieved from the old Bell cottage. On it, faint smudges of gold paint still clung in dried curves. "This was beneath the bureau when we lifted the floorboard," she explained. "It wasn't there before the painting, and it doesn't match the main colour scheme of the parlour." Crail inspected it. So, Miss Marple said calmly, this wasn't part of Lavinia's design. It was something Locksley brought himself, something he used not to decorate the room, but to mark where he had hidden the past. Crail leaned back. He knew about the hidden compartment. He did, and I believe he suspected Lavinia had left something there. But he didn't remove it, perhaps out of guilt or fear. Instead, he painted around it, like a signature, a final, private message. Crail frowned. Then why not destroy it altogether? Because he wanted someone to find it, Miss Marple said softly. Not Lavinia. She already knew. But perhaps Alice. Or perhaps he hoped someone else would understand the design, that the past couldn't remain buried. Then he's not entirely innocent. No, she agreed. He isn't. But he is no murderer. Later that night, under the weight of an early autumn moon, Miss Marple stood once more before the old Bell cottage. The property had been sealed for good this time. The will was now under probate, and Alice would likely receive nothing after the criminal proceedings. The solicitor from Basingstoke had already begun the process of returning several items of Lavinia's estate to distant relatives. Her paintings were to be donated. The garden would be left to overgrow. But the parlour remained. Miss Marple let herself in with the key. Inspector Crail had permitted her to borrow for one final visit. She walked slowly, passing the hallway where Lavinia's sketch of the young girl, Alice, still hung. The face, though innocent, now seemed guarded, as though even in childhood she had known she was meant to be something other than what she was told. Inside the painted parlour, the vines still climbed. Miss Marple stood before them for a long while. She imagined Lavinia here, supervising the colours, giving orders, watching, always watching. She saw Locksley's hand brushing the gold leaf into the curls, not as decoration, but as apology. And she imagined Alice, unaware that she was walking through a room filled with ghosts. The golden vines glinted faintly as the moonlight broke through the stained glass window. You can paint over guilt, but it still bleeds through. Miss Marple closed the door behind her and let the key fall into her handbag with a soft click. Some truths were best uncovered. Others, perhaps, were best remembered only quietly, like an old photograph folded away in a drawer. Back in her cottage, she poured herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her chair. Outside, the wind stirred the rose bushes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Her fingers moved slowly, steadily, looping red wool over silver needles. In her mind, she saw the painted parlour once more, and this time she allowed herself the comfort of imagining it repainted again, not in vines and gold, but in something honest, something simple, maybe pale blue, maybe sunlight yellow. No secrets, just walls, because in the end, that was what Lavinia Pinkerton never understood. Walls may keep out the world, but they cannot keep out the truth. Chapter 10. The truth beneath the vines? It was nearly a week after the events had reached their quiet conclusion when Miss Marple was summoned to the vicarage for tea. The autumn sun filtered through the ivy-laced windows, and the scent of spiced plum jam lingered in the air. Reverend Merriweather, seated across from her in his well-worn armchair, poured the tea with ceremonial solemnity. "I suppose," he said, "that we should all be grateful to you, Miss Marple. If not for your observations, the truth might never have come to light." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. "Oh, I don't know about that. The truth has a habit of surfacing on its own, Reverend, but I do find it's often helpful to give it a little nudge." He smiled. "Still, you saw what none of us did." She sipped her tea. "Only because I wasn't looking for a killer. I was looking for people." The Reverend nodded slowly. "What will become of Alice, do you think?" Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "That will be for the courts to decide. I imagine her barrister will argue that the death was unintended, that the dose of digitalis was meant only to frighten. And perhaps that's true." She never denied it, no. When she realized what had happened, she folded in on herself like a punctured parasol. She couldn't bring herself to confess it aloud, but the truth was written in her face. "And the father," Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "Jonathan Locksley has already vanished again. The authorities had no grounds to hold him further, no conclusive link to the death, no poison on his hands, just a history of absence. And yet," the Reverend said, "in some ways he set it all in motion." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "His return awakened the past, but it was fear, not the man himself, that proved fatal." The Reverend grew quiet. Outside, a pair of finches fluttered at the edge of the vicarage garden. The wind carried the scent of drying leaves and distant bonfires. 2 days later, Miss Marple visited the cottage once more, this time not alone. A small group from the Women's Guild had taken it upon themselves to ensure the property was respectfully cleared. Lavinia's personal effects were being boxed, her wardrobe sorted for donation. But Miss Marple had only one errand. She entered the painted parlour for the final time. The vines, once so vivid, had already begun to crack and peel at the edges. Without Lavinia's care, the room was returning to what it had always been beneath. Just walls, just paint. She stepped forward, opened the bureau, and withdrew the journal one last time. She didn't reread it. She merely turned to the final page. There, in Lavinia's careful hand, was one final note, dated 2 days before her death. "Fear time has betrayed me, but I no longer wish to hide. Alice must know the truth, even if she hates me for it. To bury the past is to bury love, and I have done that once already. No more. Let what comes come." Miss Marple closed the book, died ready to face the truth, she thought. But the truth, in its own cruel way, came too late. Alice Dunnington, now held in custody, awaiting formal charges, had asked to see Miss Marple before her transfer to the county court. The meeting was held in a small private room at the back of the magistrate's office. Alice looked wan, but composed. "I wanted to ask," she said softly, "do you believe I meant to kill her?" Miss Marple met her eyes. "No, but I believe you were prepared to lose her." Alice flinched. She controlled everything. What? I knew who I was. I spent my life in her shadow. I thought if I could stop her from doing it again, I'd finally have some power. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, the moment she died, you lost more than you ever imagined. Alice's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. I didn't want her dead. I just wanted her stopped. You loved her, even in anger, Miss Marple said. But love twisted by secrecy and fear is a dangerous thing. Alice nodded. What happens now? That, said Miss Marple, rising, is no longer my part.